Now, there's a big debate about the origins
Thanks,
of the
Sherry.
virus and whether it leaked from a lab or not. Why is it important to know how this outbreak occurred?
Well, I think if there are questions that China has to answer about its virology research, that is something the world has a compelling interest in after we have now well over 100,000 people dead across the world and plenty more to come, I fear. This is something for which China must be held accountable. And it seems to me that if that is a possibility, that it came from a lab rather than from the wet markets, really the Communist Party should be owning up to it. We have a really strong interest here in wanting to make sure that something like this never happens again. SARS came out of Wuhan only a decade earlier. So we can't afford to be in a situation where 5 years from now we're dealing with an even worse virus than the one that we've got. So Beijing has to open up, it seems to me.
Yeah. Look, irrespective of where the virus came from, China, as I've just said, chose to deliberately cover it up. In what ways do you think were just the worst, in terms of their inability to tell the rest of the world about the virus?
Well, Shari, this is the sort of working operational mode of the Communist Party. If there is ever a problem, it will be covered up and denied until it becomes unhideable. And we've seen this all the way through. I think the worst part of what has happened here is that as soon as Beijing became aware of this problem in Wuhan, which was around the end of last year, it was making calculated steps to work out how it could emerge from this crisis more successful than anyone else. So, for example, their foreign minister was telling our foreign minister at the end of January that this was curable and essentially a minor problem at exactly the same time as Chinese-based companies in Australia, or Chinese companies based in Australia, were strip mining protective equipment out of Australia to send to Wuhan. So there has been, I think, lies and duplicity aplenty from the Communist Party, not just towards Australia, but to every country around the world. And I think that helps to explain the sense of anger that I think is behind some of the statements coming from political leaders now, that we, cannot allow ourselves to be treated in this way by the Communist Party. And the party has to actually come clean and own up to what it did.
Yeah, look, China's, buy-up of medical supplies the world over while denying that there was a problem, as you just said, was just absolutely despicable. Now, look, you've argued, when I've interviewed you for this story in the past week, you've argued that China's failure to disclose the pandemic in adequate time has actually now given them a strategic advantage. How is this the case?
Well, it has in a number of areas. One, of course, is that they are the supply chain controllers for a great deal of the medical equipment, which is now desperately needed around the world. And we've seen some of the consequences of that with the Andrew Forrest purchase of $320 million worth of equipment from China, which, of course, we now have to pay for. So there's a supply chain problem. There's a diplomatic problem because China is, particularly in the developed world and much of Europe, now presenting itself as the saviour of the world, ironically enough, with medical gear. And there's a military problem, Shari. I believe that elite units of the Chinese military, Navy ships and aircraft, their crews and pilots must have been quarantined very early in the piece to give China assurance that they could put to sea and put their aircraft into the air safely. And as a result of that, we've seen a game of strategic chicken being played between the People's Liberation Army and the armies or the militaries of Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, down into the South China Sea. It's all about presenting China as making a massive show of force, saying to the world, we have managed this crisis in a way that's superior to the United States, so you better buckle under to us. That's the overall message that I think China is trying to extract out of the crisis. And at the same time, it's a great distraction for their domestic population as well, which has a right to be pretty unhappy with the party's management of the virus. But China is now trying a nationalistic exercise to rally its people around the flag. And that puts us, I think, into a fairly risky military territory, even at the same time as we're dealing with a health pandemic.
Look, Peter, finally, do you think there's any possibility at all, and all the leaders have said that this is not the case, but do you think there's any possibility that this was a deliberate leak from the lab? And does China have warfare programs running at all? And of course, that would be separately from the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Well, China most certainly does have biological warfare programs. It's also interested, frankly, in a range of fairly esoteric DNA altering, gene altering technologies, which might seek to might give it a military edge. I doubt very much that there was a deliberate release of this. I don't think that the Communist Party cares very much about Chinese deaths, but they do care a great deal about the Chinese economy, and I don't think they would have trashed the economy. So my view on this, Shari, is that I don't think this was a biological warfare agent, but the Communist Party is doing its absolute best to turn the consequences of the virus into a weaponised strategy for itself all around the world. And that's really something that I think we should be absolutely resisting.
So that's such an
interesting point here in Australia.
Such an interesting point that it might not have been, or it wasn't a weapon to begin with, but they're now weaponising the response to it now that it's happened.
Absolutely, Shari, and I think there's two reasons for that. One is to try and gain advantage against other countries in the world, particularly the United States. The other is to distract their population. The Communist Party is always deeply worried about whether the population is happy with the party and prepared to put up with party control. And one way you do that is to get them to rally around the flag for various nationalist causes, like taking control over Taiwan. And I think that's the crisis that we potentially could face as we move into 2021.